I said, I'm going to go ahead and, of course, move on to talk about, World War One, the era. I'll probably at least talk about the early aspect of the war, up to like 1914, maybe even 1915 a little bit, if I do have time, and all that. And yeah, World War One, like I said, is the first of like these two world wars that broke out, of course, in Europe. It lasted, by the way, from 1914 to 1918 is the actual dates. It should be, 1914 to 1918. And you can see it resulted in like something like 9 million soldiers being killed. That doesn't include like civilians. I think if you include civilians, you're looking at another 15, 20 million maybe that may have been killed worldwide overall. You also had that Spanish flu pandemic thing that happened too, like at the end of it, that also contributed to a lot of people dying also at the end of the war. And so, yeah, the amount of deaths because of the war was probably way more than that, worldwide. They had different names for the war. World War One is not a name they start calling it until they have World War II, or they also call it the First World War. So either one is used. And then World War II is called also the Second World War as well. The old timers, like the veterans that fought in the war, they call it the Great War. That's what they called it. You may have heard that term they started using for it, that it was the war to end all wars, that there would be no more wars after that. But they do think that World War One was like a catalyst for all the other wars that came later. In fact, all the weapons and stuff they use in World War One are used in all the other wars later, from machine guns to flamethrowers, tanks, and airplanes, and submarines. All those kind of things that they, of course, used in World War One are all used later. The first thing, of course, I will be getting into today, we'll be kind of talking about, like the causes of the war, like why did World War One break out, which there's all kinds of reasons why World War One broke out. So you have multiple causes that you can see in this list here. Those are like the main ones they usually talk about, all the different isms that kind of went back to really the 1800s, like the 19th century. Like you've got the rise of nationalism, which I'll probably talk about the most first. Imperialism was another thing too, also that was part of it. And militarism. They're talking about like the fact that these different states, like mostly in Europe, kind of stockpiled a lot of weapons, like arms races between different countries. And they think that helped to contribute to the war. Entangling alliances. We'll get to that later. Triple Alliance versus the Triple Entente. That's basically the main thing that really contributed to why the war broke out. In fact, World War One was like a chain reaction war. You study about it. But a lot of the causes stem from, you can see, a combination of long-term versus short-term causes, which is true. We'll get to the short one later. Some guy gets shot, about that. But yeah, the rivalries, like the so-called great powers that were in Europe, they contribute a lot to why a lot of the war broke out. You've got these are all the great powers in Europe that they had that really contribute to why World War One occurred. Britain, France, Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, even Ottoman empires included too. In the list, the Turks, who still controlled part of Eastern Europe, they obviously get into the war too as well. Of course, the United States as well later joins the war, mostly due to German aggression in the Atlantic, and also dealings with Mexico, which I'll explain later about that. Of course, I'll talk first about one of the major issues that really caused World War I. The rise of nationalism had a lot to do with it, which went back to the 1800s. In the 1800s, you had this case where a lot of countries started unifying as nation states. One of the most famous was Germany, also Italy. Both those unified close to about 1870, around that range. And like German unification, which happened in 1871, was the brainchild of Otto von Bismarck. He was known as the Iron Chancellor. He was like one of their first major prime ministers that came to power. And under the Kingdom of Prussia, Prussia was able to kind of form a German state, which became an empire over time. And they think the German Empire formed from the German Confederation that originally existed in Germany after the Congress of Vienna was created. And they formed like a confederation of German states that were above Austria, and that became the so-called German Empire. And the German Empire usually comes into fruition after the Franco-Prussian War, 1870-71, when France lost to Prussia. It caused the collapse of the so-called Second French Empire when Napoleon III abdicated, I think, which was in 1870, I believe it was. So yeah, a combination of that collapse of the Second French Empire, contributed to the German Empire coming, to what it would be later in the late 19th century. Also, I'll put it up here too, but they think the decline of the Russian Empire was another reason why Germany came to power too, as an empire, because the Russian Empire was declining in the East. In fact, they had lost to Japan at one point, I think in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, 1905. And so then Russia had these revolutions, Russian Revolution of 1905, I think it was, and they had the one in 1917. So Russia's declining as a power, compared to other powers as well. They also had the unification of Italy. Italy formed into what they called the Kingdom of Italy. And anyway, so maybe you've heard of Count Cavour. Yeah, Count Cavour. He was very famous, one of their first great prime ministers they have. He helped to kind of create Italy, which formed as a state in the 1860s. And Italy formed out of multiple areas. Italy, Sardinia, also Piedmont, which was up in the northwestern part of Italy, and then Sicily. That all became like one state, pretty much. So Italy's later in the war too. They get involved in World War I as well. These are other nation states too, which you start to see popping up in the 1800s. They were part of nationalism. You have the Poles in Poland. They all want a state too, as well. A lot of the Slavs, that's going to be a big thing later, and it's going to be a big, big problem, like especially Yugoslavia. That's what caused the war, in the Balkans. Got all these Slavs that want to create the Slavic state of Yugoslavia. So that's you got Czechoslovakian peoples and all that that are also there. Greek independence, 1832. That's another thing, of course. The Belgians formed 1831 as a state. Hungarians wanted their own state too. So you got all these different peoples that kind of want to break away. Didn't include the Arabs. Like in the Middle East, the Arabs wanted their own state too. They end up fighting the Turks. They want to break away from them. A lot of Jewish people too. They get Zionism, those kind of ideas start kind of popping up, in Europe and so on in the 1800s. Then they got new imperialism or imperialism. That's something else you start seeing too. That was, they think, a cause of why World War I happened as well. And like the European powers, they started basically colonizing different parts of the world. Africa was, of course, one of the main areas that the Europeans went into in the 1800s. Parts of Asia, they started taking over like China, Southeast Asia, etc. The Pacific, a lot of different islands in the Pacific. Of course, the European powers got into. And the scramble for Africa was probably the most famous aspect of new imperialism, in the 1800s. We had all those countries right there. You see that wanted to try and, colonize these. They think a lot of this was an extension of the whole Industrial Revolution, the rise of capitalism, because they wanted to develop these areas, for natural resources, cheap labor, new markets to sell their goods. And so they exploited those areas, and that's important later because it does contribute to World War I being a world war, because, when World War I broke out, all the different colonists fought each other, like the Germans fighting the British and the French and the Dutch and I think the Portuguese, etc., in parts of Africa. So that's something that does happen because of it. I talked about militarism already, but there was this big arms race I told you that happened before the war. which they think a lot of it was caused by the Industrial Revolution, the fact that they created all these new kinds of weapons in war, from machine guns that could fire 500-600 bullets a minute, new kinds of artillery using steel, poison gas, new kinds of weaponry like tanks, repeating rifles, submarines, the airplane. So you can name all kinds of new kinds of weapons that started to be used, in World War One, and so that's why World War One was so bloody. So many men get killed. You're in a trench. You try to take the other guy's trench, they just mow you down. Machine guns. You got no chance. So, of course, the main thing that would cause World War One to break out would be the rival alliance systems, like the entangling alliance systems. Of course, that was the main thing that really caused World War One to really break out, because it was a chain reaction war. So you got these two alliance systems. Well, if you attack one country that's in that alliance, the other guys all attack you. That's what pretty much happened, basically. And you can see those are the two main alliances that they had. They had the Triple Entente, formed back in 1907, and then the Triple Alliance was the other one that was in it. You can see the ones that were in it basically originally. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy were originally in the Triple Alliance. It was formed by Germany originally, and then versus the Triple Entente, which had Britain, France, and Russia in it. They believe it was formed originally by France because Germany and France hated each other, those two states. They had fought the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s, and France had lost. And so France wanted to basically form an alliance with these other states to prevent being invaded again by the Germans. France gets invaded 3 times, by the way. It's terrible. But anyway, later they changed the names. I don't know if you know this or not, but like in the Triple Alliance is later called the Central Powers in World War One, because there's more than 3 that are in it later in the war. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. Those are all the countries that end up in that alliance in World War One. That was the Triple Alliance. Italy refused to support the Germans, by the way, in Austria-Hungary, because they wanted to fight Austria-Hungary. And so they stayed neutral till 1915. So they kind of dropped out and support the Allies. Now, the Triple Entente was later called the Allied Powers or Allies during World War One. It's called that also in World War Two. And Britain, France, Russia were the original powers that were in that, of course, throughout the war. But you can see those are some other powers that were in it too. Italy joined in 1915. The United States, 1917. Serbia and Romania, I think, were pretty much in it from the beginning. I think around 1914. Serbia, yeah, those two right there. And so, yeah, those are all the powers that were on the other side. They had other powers too as well, but those are the main ones that really fought in the war pretty much throughout it. We didn't really do much in the United States in the war. We 130,000 killed, I think, in World War One of the United States. So it's not as much compared to some of these other countries, which had like close to 1 million or more that died in the war. All right, now the thing I need to talk about today, is there was this, of course, famous man, that was assassinated in World War One that really, before World War One broke out, that really caused it, which, of course, here we go here, which is the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who, by the way, was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Actually, his uncle, by the way, was the actual ruler, whose name was Franz Joseph I. He had been on the throne since the 1800s. Anyway, what happened, if you know about it, he was assassinated on June 28th, 1914, city called Sarajevo, which is in Bosnia. And so his death would, help to contribute to what would be later, the outbreak of the war. Because, Austria-Hungary is pretty angry about his killing. And it was planned. It wasn't something that just happened by accident, that kind of thing. It was a planned, pretty much assassination, which they believe the organization that was behind it was called the Black Hand. The Black Hand was the secret military organization, more like a terrorist group, really, is what a lot of people kind of viewed it as, which was in Serbia. In fact, it was part of the Serbian military. And it was mostly these pan-Slavic nationalists that wanted to basically create assassinations to hopefully get statehood. Serbia was already a kingdom, the Kingdom of Serbia, but they wanted to create a more wider state, which would be like a Yugoslavia, which would be created after World War I. So that was the main goal of why they wanted to kill the Archduke, pretty much. And there's a picture showing the man that was behind it. He was actually part of the Serbian military, whose name, I put him on the screen, was Dragutin Dimitrievich, and they called him Apis, which I think Apis was some kind of nickname that meant the bull. Because I guess with his little mustache he had, looks like a bull. And so he's the guy that planned it. I think he was in Serbian military intelligence. He was a colonel. And it says captain. I know he's a colonel, actually, at one point. But he actually hired like 7 men to go do. Actually, young boys. I think it's kind of what they really were. They're like young men that were like, I want to say teenagers, like 18 to 20 years old. And it was part of a suicide mission. They were given bombs, like grenades, pistols. For some reason, all of them had tuberculosis. They were like dying, and they thought pretty much they're going to die anyway. Just sent them to try to kill him. The man that, of course, that became famous later that would shoot the Archduke, as you know, is this man named Gavrilo Princip. I think I've got a better picture of him right here. Yeah, Princip on the right. He's the assassin. And Princip was a 19-year-old Bosnian. Like, I think he was a student, I believe. And he was given like a pistol. And he was part of this group called the Young Bosnia. That was like a kind of a pan-Slavic group that wanted, I think, Bosnia to join Serbia as a state, I guess part of Yugoslavia. And so he actually trained, I think, for a while, I think near Belgrade, as part of the Black Hand. He would go into like forests, and he would like shoot at trees, like target practice. And supposedly Gavrilo Princip was a horrible shot, the way he would shoot at a tree and miss or something like that. It's a terrible shot, which was kind of ironic. I don't know if you know about the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, but Ferdinand was like himself a great shot. He was, considered he was an avid hunter, big game hunter. It's what he's kind of known for. And he was famous for going on a lot of these safaris and killing a lot of animals. And I think they say he killed somewhere between 200,000-300,000 animals as a hunter. It's crazy. And I think he's got them all numbered, like in his palace, which I think is in Austria today. It's just nuts. But anyway, so let me kind of talk about the assassination a little bit. Actually, what's weird about the assassination, there were 2 attempts on his life. There were, not 1, 2, believe it or not, which happened on June 28th in Sarajevo. And why was the Archduke, by the way, going to Sarajevo? You can see here he was going for like a state visit because apparently the Austro-Hungarian armies were doing military exercises near the Serbian border. There's talk of maybe invading Serbia and like adding it to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so that's why he was there. And so he brought his wife with him. Anyway, it just happened that it was their wedding anniversary. It was the day, June 28th. And then, of course, they turned in an open convertible car. I do have the car, by the way, which is right here. So you can see it right here. It's kind of like similar to the John F. Kennedy assassination, that happened in 1963. So there they are right there. There's another picture showing them like in the car, I think I had, which was right here. I know I've got different images of it. I got this one right here where he's kind of shaking that guy's hand right there. This painting I showed you earlier, it kind of depicts it wrong. I believe that his wife, Sophie, was sitting on the right and he was on the left. They have different paintings. I know they show a depiction of him getting shot and all that, but likely I think that was the actual way it was. He was on the left, he was on the right, right there in the car. And I think there were 4 other men in the car with him. There was actually, I think, an Austro-Hungarian general that was with him too. That I think Princip was trying to shoot too, as well. And prior to that, though, it's weird. They had one of the assassins named Neljelko Kabranovich, he actually threw a bomb, like a grenade, at the cars that went through the city, like the motorcade. And the bomb, actually, the grenade missed. It blew up, and I think it injured a bunch of people, but it failed to kill the Archduke. And so when the Archduke went, I think, to meet with the mayor of Sarajevo, he was very furious. He said, "One here comes for the visit, and they throw bombs at me." He was really mad about it. And so I guess they thought they were going to throw flowers at him instead. And so he probably should have left. I think at that point, I guess he didn't think it was somebody else that was going to try to, kill him. And so what happened was they got back in the car, and the Archduke decided that what the best thing to do was that they'd go visit the wounded that got injured from the grenade. And so on the way to the hospital, like at one of the Sarajevo hospitals, that's when he got shot, basically. And I think they say the driver didn't exactly know where to go. And he drove down like a dead end, or he drove the wrong way. And he right to where, I guess, Princip was. I think Princip was in like a cafe eating lunch or something, and he came out and saw the car. And so he basically walked up to him. I think he jumped on the running board and shot him. Is what happened. And I'll blow up the car, but he shot him at him twice. There's actually, I don't know, it's hard to see in that picture right there, but if you look here, there's a bullet hole, which is right here. So one of the shots hit here. They think that he shot the Archduke first, which I think he shot him in the neck. And then he tried to shoot again, but I think Sophie was in the way, his wife, and she got shot. And so he didn't mean to shoot her. It was an accident, basically. I think he may have been trying to shoot one of the governors or general that was in the car with him. I know that. It was the guy with him that he wanted to kill too, but he missed him and shot her, I think, is what happened. So both, by the way, end up dying, basically. I think they both died before they get to the hospital and all that. Princip, by the way, is captured afterwards. I think there's an image showing Princip basically right here. I think they show up here kind of after he's getting captured, and you can kind of see it looks like he's been beaten up, which was true. I think they took their I think some of the guards took their swords. They took the broadside of it. They beat him in the head with it afterwards. And then you can see the pistol too that was used. It was a Browning semi-automatic 1910 model that he used to basically shoot the Archduke. And it's amazing how, that shooting right there would end up causing 9 million deaths in World War I, which is true. And Princip and like the 6 other conspirators, by the way, were caught. They were put on trial. I think most of them died in prison. I think of tuberculosis. I think Princip died, I want to say in 1960 is what occurred. So yeah, what happens, with this, because, Princip kills the Archduke at this point, it upsets Austria-Hungary. They're furious, about this with the Kingdom of Serbia. And so they demand that the Black Hand members that were part of that be arrested. In fact, Dragan Dimitrovic, actually his own people, they eventually arrested him for it. You know about this, and had him shot. I think it was at 16 as well. He was killed, but too late, because Austria-Hungary decided eventually that they wanted to declare war on Serbia, and had the backing of Germany. Germany was willing to pretty much give, Austria-Hungary a blank check to fight Serbia. And Kaiser Wilhelm, who was the leader of Germany at the time, who helped really instigate the wider part of the war, pretty much was a major supporter of the Triple Alliance in Austria-Hungary. So basically, on July 28th, 1914, you're going to have Austria-Hungary, invade Serbia. That's going to really precipitate what would be the beginning of World War I. And it doesn't start out as a major war. It looks like these two countries, start fighting each other, but it's going to blow up into a more wider war that's going to, of course, lead to the Great War. So that's the other thing, of course, I want to get into today. I want to kind of talk about some of the things that happened, after, the implications, I guess, of the assassination, because you're going to get the Germans, come in, and the Germans are going to, declare war on all of Europe, because of what occurs. And what causes this? Well, it's kind of between like Germany and the Russians. You have this deal where both those states start to mobilize after Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. You can see here that the Russians backed Serbia. They were kind of like allied with each other. A lot of it had to do with the fact that both Serbia and Russia had a lot of people that were Orthodox Christians that were there. Also Slavic. You got a lot of Slavs in Russia. Well, you got a lot of Slavs in Serbia. So that actually didn't help as well. And then Germany's obviously part of the, the triple alliance that they got. And so that's the other reason why they're in the war as well later. And what ends up happening, it causes a crisis to occur in Europe, which was called the July Crisis, which happens over several days, like less than a week. And there's this huge escalation between the different powers in Europe over what to do, with all this mobilization starting at that point. And what ends up happening is all these major countries all mobilize their forces, and it becomes a huge war, like overnight, just in a few days, like less than a week, probably. And the Germans decide that they got to go on the offensive because they're really concerned that what's going to occur is that basically, if they don't, they're going to have to fight a two-front war. The Triple Entente is located, you got what? France and Russia, right? Mostly east and west. And so they're going to have to end up fighting in two different directions. They know this. In fact, the Germans had been planning this for years, fearing that this would happen because the Triple Entente, alliance. And so that's why the Germans decided to declare war on France and Russia, basically at the beginning of the war in early August. So that's something you can see there. They start, declaring war at that point. So this causes, Russia, France, Britain to declare war on the Germans. Then Austria-Hungary, comes in too, because, they're allied with the Germans, etc. Except Italy. Italy decides to stay neutral when the war breaks out, which was kind of a surprise. They thought they would back Austria-Hungary and maybe Germany, but they would later switch to the Allied side in 1915 because Italy wanted to get a piece of Austria-Hungary, like around the Alps and the Adriatic Sea. And so that's why you end up, with them staying, they break from the Triple Alliance, is what they basically, of course, do. So the Germans basically declared war on France, Russia, and also Belgium, by the way, too, which they would, August 1st to the 4th. It's pretty much the dates, of course, when they would do that. And let me talk about why they did all this. And of course, I kind of mentioned about this. In fact, they had this alliance, this military plan that they've been working on for a while. That was called the so-called Schlieffen Plan, which you can see here. It was a plan that was drawn up in 1905 by this German general named Alfred von Schlieffen. And of course, you can see the idea of the whole thing was to avoid fighting a two-front war against France and Russia. You can see there. And so you can see the main part of the plan basically was to attack through Belgium and I think Luxembourg, come around here, you can see, and take Paris. It's kind of like the Franco-Prussian War. I didn't really get into that war as much, but it's kind of like that. They kind of do the same thing. Maybe lay siege to Paris if they had to, but they would try to sweep around here and take northeastern France, which the northern part of France was important because it was the most industrialized area of France. They take that over and the French would be done. And then you can see there what they would then do is then they would then mobilize their forces to attack the Russians later, to kind of defeat them. And so, they relied on speed, obviously, to move their forces as quick as possible. They thought the Russians, by the way, wouldn't be able to mobilize as fast. Well, they thought the British wouldn't get in the war. They kind of messed that up too, though, with that. But that all basically was pretty much why they were, able to do that. And I think they were supposed to take like France in like 6 weeks, which is crazy with the so-called Schlieffen Plan. So interesting about that and all that. Well, what happens at the beginning of the war, Belgium, that's like the first thing that really happened, if you study about World War I, was Belgium fell pretty quickly. Here's a kind of a map showing you. I could look at a map here too first to show also like the different alliances that you have later in the war. So they kind of, like I said, the Allied Central Power names that you get later that you get in the war. But Belgium is like one of those first countries that gets invaded by the Germans, and they're pretty much occupied throughout most of the war. They are. And Belgium would fall on August the 21st, 1914. And then from there, what would happen was the Germans would push into northern France and try to take the capital Paris. Those were the main goal of the Schlieffen Plan. And the French were aided by the British, who sent in like a initial force, which I think initially was called the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF. And they'll contribute a lot of men in the war, because the British lose something like 900,000 men in the war, get killed in World War I. And I think the French lose over 1 million men also as well. And the Germans advanced as far as like close to like, I think northeast of Paris. And it led eventually to the so-called Battle of the Marne, which originally was called later the so-called First Battle of the Marne, which that battle took place over a period of like a week, like in the second week of like September. And the German forces, if you say about the First Battle of the Marne, it involved something like 2 million men involved in the battle. That's a lot. That's the most troops ever really in probably world history or even European history ever at that point. I think the largest battle before that was the Battle of Leipzig, where the coalition powers of Europe defeated Napoleon in Germany at the Battle of the Nations. I think there was like 500,000-600,000 troops that fought in that battle. Believe it or not, that was the casualties, I think, or something like that. Actually, in the First Battle of the Marne, 500,000-600,000 were killed and wounded, believe it or not, both sides. Very bloody. First, a lot of the battles were bloody, in World War I. And what happened was the German drive on Paris, it stalled. They didn't have enough forces, I think is what it was, to really take Paris. Also, I think what happened too, if you read about this, the Russians came in and mobilized faster than they thought. They had to bring force to the east to attack them too. And so they didn't have enough force to really take Paris. And with really counterattacks from the French and also with the British, they were able to stop them and all that. And so it ends up, causing the so-called Western Front to form in northern France, which becomes later the so-called bloodiest front really in World War I that'll occur. And one of the things that happens that's very famous at the beginning of World War I, you may have heard about this, but they had this thing that was called the Race to the Sea. That happened in, I want to say it happened like September, October was the main period of it that occurred. What happened was both sides started establishing trenches, like defensively along the front, which went from like Switzerland up through France, and then all the way to like Belgium, where the North Sea is. And that's what they call it, the Race to the Sea. And so that helped to kind of contribute to why the war ended up being kind of a defensive war on the Western Front, and resulted in bloody, trench warfare, which you can see that resulted in 13 million casualties on the Western Front. That includes killed and wounded and so on, captured, etc. And this occurred, between 1914 to 1918. So no other front really compares to that really in World War I. In World War II, Eastern Front was the bloodiest front that they had. This one was, of course, the worst one that they had. And I'll get more into the warfare, like some of the campaigns, that were fought in the war that were very bad. But that weren't all the fronts that they had. They had numerous fronts, they were fought pretty much in World War One overall. And but yeah, part of why trench warfare was so bad, was it was a combination of not just weaponry, but I think they say that a majority of men that died in the war was because of disease. There's all kinds of disease you could get: trench foot, dysentery. Of course, they got the influenza epidemic later. They had so you had all kinds of things that could have killed you during the war. But yeah, you can see all the new kinds of weaponry that came into World War One that kind of made it bloody. So all kinds of new kinds of machine guns, which says 300 bullets, but I think there was some that could fire up to 500-600 bullets. Hotchkiss, the Maxim machine gun, Browning machine guns that were kind of used during the war that were well known. New kinds of artillery, like the Germans had this famous artillery you may have heard called the Big Bertha. It was well known. Different kinds of chemical weapons. Chlorine and mustard gas were the most chief kinds of chemical weapons that were used during World War One. They were pretty bad. They weren't used too much after that. Chemical weapons. I think the only thing I could think of close to that would be Saddam Hussein. I think using the Iran-Iraq war, like mustard gas, I know as an example. U-boats or submarines. Submarines is something you start seeing, of course, being used during the war as well. The Germans had Zeppelins. I'm sure you know what Zeppelins were, where they used that to kind of either do observation of the enemy. There's even a case where the Germans actually sent Zeppelins over Britain, like England, and bombed them, kind of like they would do in World War II as well. Flamethrowers were invented, of course, in World War One, which were later used in other conflicts as well. The tank. It was a new weapon the British developed, which was first used at the Battle of the Somme, 1916. So there's all kinds of new kinds of weaponry that were used in warfare. Of course, the airplane, also was something they started using. Really, the first war where that was used in combat as well. So all those contributed to make World War One very bloody, and other wars that would come later. They think the tank at the end of the war kind of contributed to why the Allies kind of won, believe it or not, later. Right, let me get into it. I did want to talk about, what were some of the other fronts that were in World War One that were big. I think I've got a map showing you some of the different fronts that existed in the war that are right here. I'll kind of blow it up for you, but yeah, there's all kinds of multiple fronts that were fought, in World War One as a whole. Yeah, the one that was the most famous besides the Western Front was the Eastern Front. They had that was a campaign where the Central Powers, which were Germany, Austria-Hungary, I think Bulgaria was in it too a little bit. They basically fought against Russia, the Russian Empire. By the way, that was Germany's most successful campaign of the whole war. They did pretty good in that war. Germans did pretty good against the Soviets early on, up to 1941 in World War II as well. And just like in World War II, if you know about what happened, the Germans were able to push back the Russians back into what is Poland. They also took over the Ukraine. And actually, I think at one point they seized part of the Crimea. Yeah, which is true about that. And the bad thing about World War I, which we'll get to later, the Russians suffered heavy casualties during the war. You can see up to 9 million, 6 million killed and also wounded. Another 3 million were captured by the Central Powers during the war. And it later led also to occupation by the, I think the Germans ended up occupying Finland, by the way, up in here somewhere. I think it was up in here somewhere, Finland. Finland became like a separate state. It broke away from Russia after the war. So, yeah, they didn't fare well, in the war. And as you know, one of the things that happened, of course, with World War One was the defeat of Russia in the war. It led to the Russian Revolution, which caused the collapse of the Romanov dynasty, the Russian Empire. And you'll see the downfall later of Nicholas II. He is forced to abdicate in early 1917. And eventually, because of that, it kind of left a vacuum in Russia. In later, the Bolsheviks, who end up being called the communists later, you'd have communists that would seize power in Russia. That would lead to the Soviet Union forming. So the formation of the Soviet Union was something that kind of was one of the remnants from like the end of World War One that we'll talk about later, more or less. Another front too they had as well was they had the Italian front, which happened between like 1915 to 1918. They call it different names. Some people call it the Alpine front because most of the conflict took place in the Alps, up in the northeastern part of Italy. Really tough fighting with that because mountain fighting and stuff like that made it very bloody as a whole. And Italy got in the war against Austria-Hungary because they wanted to seize control of that area. And that map you can see about right, they wanted to take control of this area here. And also, I think along the Adriatic Sea, there was talk of maybe trying to seize here as well. And the two biggest battles, I think, that were fought in that campaign that were well known were they had the Battle of Caporetto, I think, which was in 1917, where the Italians lost. And the most strategic battle, I think they talk about sometimes, is the Battle of Vittorio Veneto, 1918, was, I think, considered the most strategic battle, really, of the Italian campaign, where the Italians defeated the Hungarians and led to the end of the war there that they had. And we don't really talk much about that campaign, but I don't know if you ever read the book Farewell to Arms, which was written by Ernest Hemingway in the 1920s. But Hemingway was a famous novelist later that volunteered to go to Italy. You had some Americans that volunteered to go over there to help out the Red Cross. You know about this? And so he was a Red Cross ambulance driver during the war. His experiences in the war later led to him writing a book about it, which was A Farewell to Arms. It's actually a love story where he fell in love with this nurse who was working there as well. And that's where he got the idea for it. So, and then they had the Balkans campaign too. That was where Austria-Hungary fought against Serbia. And they invaded Serbia, which I think was initially, they had trouble at the beginning, but eventually the Central Powers invaded Serbia. But they were later rebuffed in all that. That's one that's not talked about as much, that one. But that campaign later, after the war, will later lead to what is like Yugoslavia forming, which will kind of form out of that area, which is about like in this area right here. So that's where that campaign was fought, which was right there. Also, they had like this other campaign, of course, which was they had the Middle Eastern campaign. Yeah, they fought there, which that was fought all over the place in the Middle East. Palestine, like Sinai region, the Jordan area, Iraq, or Mesopotamia, as they called it back then, Iran, Turkey. So all those areas were areas that they were kind of, they fought in the war. You don't see that as much in the map here, but they do show like kind of some, it's like right here, they show some kind of defense lines right over here that are fought right over here and over here. But they were fighting like, I'll get to it later, like Gallipoli over here, and way down here, like down where Jordan is and all that. They were fighting in those areas also as well. You may have heard of Lawrence of Arabia, like T. Lawrence. He was kind of involved in a lot of the fighting with the British, with the Arabs, and he got a lot of the Arabs to kind of fight against the Turks because they weren't very good at fighting militarily, trained a lot of their forces, and he helped like seize like part of like Jordan and things like that, which contribute to why the British start defeating the Turks in the war. And that's part of why Turkey forms later, because they end up losing most of their territory except the area around like where Turkey is now, as you can see there. But most of the Ottoman Empire after the war will be broken up. Is what's going to happen Republic of Turkey will form out of it, and then a bunch of those other states like Iraq, Iran, Syria, Israel later, kind of form out of that area that they have. You can't see it in the map. They had an African front. They did. You had a case where all those powers there, Britain, France, Portugal, Italy, Belgium, they had all these colonies in Africa. They started fighting the Germans that were there as well. East, West Africa, they fought. South Africa, all those areas. I want to say close to Angola, South Africa, Tanzania. Those were areas that they fought the Germans, of course. And they primarily used African soldiers, like on both sides, that they hired, with the war. And the British and their allies end up winning it, by the way, by the end of the war. You can't see it, but in the Atlantic too, as well. Also, you have like the threat of the German U-boats as well, where the Germans use submarines to try to strangle the Allies, like supplies to their countries like France, Britain, which was almost successful. And it did help to kind of turn the war around in the favor of the Allies, because if you know about it, the Germans sank the famous Lusitania in 1915. That helped to get the United States in the war later. So that was something that was very famous about World War I as well. And I think in World War II, the Germans were more successful with their submarine warfare, because submarine warfare was still kind of primitive at that point in World War I. Let me talk about a few other things, kind of some humorous stuff about World War I, which is kind of well known. What were like some of the nicknames of the like World War I soldiers that they had in the war? Well, I got a lot of different names up here. I kind of put on the screen, but the Germans were called all kinds of nasty names. A lot of people call them the Huns. You know about this, and they called them that because they kind of compared them to Attila the Hun. When Attila had attacked Europe and all that, at the time when the Roman Empire was collapsing in Europe. So they kind of compared to that. They called them baby killers and all that. The Fritz was another term they called them too, because it seemed like every soldier was named Frederick. The nickname for Frederick is Fritz. So they're all Fritz. They call them Krauts. I don't know if you know the term Kraut. Kraut's the term for like cabbage, which I think was short for sauerkraut. They put sauerkraut like on sausage, things like that. La Boche, I think, was just a French term that they used, which meant the cabbage head or the cabbage people, because they ate like the sauerkraut and all that, and so they called them that, La Boche. The French were called Pelou, which Pelou was a term that meant hairy ones, I think, or hairy guys, hairy ones. And a lot of the French soldiers didn't shave. They just grew beards in the trenches. And so that's why they're called that. And then, of course, if you know about the French, a lot of people like the British call the French, they call them frogs. They're the frogs, Frenchy frog, because the French would sometimes eat stuff like frogs, snails and stuff like that. So the British were called Tommy a lot because supposedly one of the first soldiers that enlisted was a guy named Tommy Atkins. And every soldier was named Tommy or Thomas or Tom or whatever. And so the common name, popular name, I guess, in England. And so everybody's called Tommy. Some of them are called Limey or something like that too, I guess. If you're in the Navy. The Americans were called Yanks by the British, as an example. World War I and World War II, from Yankee or whatever. And then Doughboy was a popular name a lot of American soldiers were called in World War I. It's kind of different theories about why they're called that, but I think it had something to do with the fact that a lot of them would eat like bread a lot, like French bread, I guess. And so they're called doughboys. There's also another theory that the buttons on their uniforms look like a donut because they had a hole in it. So that have been the other theory why they call it doughboy as well. I think sometimes the Italians were called macaroni because they ate like pasta a lot. The Italians. I guess nobody's ever seen that before. Pasta, what's that? Or something like that. So yeah, macaroni. Australians, of course, we all know that they're called Aussies. It's kind of a common name. And then New Zealand's were called Kiwis. And Those two groups, by the way, but both Australia and New Zealand were kind of like these new countries that were kind of coming to fruition in the early 1900s. They were, I guess, still part of the British Empire, but they later, a lot of their men volunteered to go fight, in the war. It was like really their first conflict they ever fought in, those two states, later World War II as well. And they joined like what they call the Anzacs. The Anzacs was what they call the Australian New Zealander Army Corps. They were part of the British Empire, and they fought in like the Gallipoli campaign. They fought on the Western Front, and a lot of them suffered heavy casualties in the war too. It was really their first taste of war that they would have. And I'll get to it later, but at Gallipoli they suffered like something like 50% casualties. It was really bad. That's the first thing. I've got a few minutes left. I'll kind of go through and I'll kind of talk about some of the campaigns that were fought early on in World War I. I do have time for that, so I'll kind of get into that. When I first talk about this campaign they had that was well known, that was called the Gallipoli campaign. These were campaigns, by the way, that were fought like in 1915, 1916. It's really the first conflict you kind of hear about, like after maybe the First Battle of the Marne that was fought. And the Gallipoli campaign was a military campaign where the Allies were trying to defeat the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, because what happened was the Ottoman Empire joined the war at the end of 1916. So they joined the Central Powers. And this was a big problem, by the way. If you go to this map here that I've got, which is right here, you can see here that when they came into the war, well, it caused the whole Black Sea to be blocked. So, this prevented supplies from being gotten for Russia. That would help them in the war effort, fighting the Germans and Austria-Hungary in the war. And so what the British wanted and other allies, they thought that one thing they could do would be to send forces up into what would be, I guess, Western Turkey and take what is basically their capital. I think at the time, Istanbul or Constantinople was the capital of their state. I don't know if it is, not anymore. I know Ankara is now. But so yeah, that was kind of what it was. And so yeah, that was the main goal of this whole campaign that the British came up with, by the way, was to seize what they called the Gallipoli Peninsula, which is right below where Istanbul is today, and then march up there and take the capital. Sounds easy, right? To do that, of course, with that. And so you can see in the map, that's kind of what the plan was basically there, was to basically take this peninsula here and then march up here. They call this area the Dardanelles area or Dardanelles Strait, which is a strait that goes into the Sea of Mara Mara, which is right here. Got the Bosphorus Strait right here. Then you got the Black Sea. So they're going to march up here, take that. And believe it or not, the actual brainchild of this whole thing was Winston Churchill at the time, who I think was part of the, I want to say he was part of the administration under the British with the Navy. He kind of came up with the idea. And so what happened was they, with a combination of naval and armed forces, which I think was like something like 600,000 troops, basically, they invaded under this general named Sir Ian Hamilton, you can see there. And you can see the amount of force they had about. So the British had the bulk of the forces, probably about 80% or more of it, about 350,000. French put up about 80,000 troops. And the Anzacs I talked about earlier had close to 65,000, which were, like I said, men that were from New Zealand and also Australia. There's actually a great movie about this if you ever want to watch it, which stars Mel Gibson. It was, I think, in 1981 it came out, which is called Gallipoli. And it kind of tells a story about this. And a lot of them trained actually, some in Australia, but I think they end up training in Egypt, believe it or not, where they were sent up there. And a lot of them got killed, which was horrible. It's got a bad ending to it. You watch it, they all die, at the end. But a lot of the fighting, the most fiercest fighting in Gallipoli, of course, was the so-called battles of Anzac Bay, the Battle of Gallipoli. You can see fought in the spring. And what happened was the Allies were not able to push inward. They only were able to kind of form a beachhead basically along the western coast of the Gallipoli Peninsula, and they got stuck there. They couldn't go further inward. And when they did, they suffered heavy casualties, on the peninsula. And I think it was like something like 50% casualties, like the Allies suffered on Gallipoli. It was a horrible campaign. It was one of the worst campaigns, I think, that the Allies suffered in the war, especially in the West. And you can see the Anzacs themselves suffered like almost 50% of their forces was killed and wounded. If you study about Australia and New Zealand today, they still have what they call Anzac Day there in those countries, which honor all those people that got killed and wounded. I think it's April 25th, I think is the date, I believe, for Anzac Day. The Allies later abandoned the campaign. I think by early, I want to say January, February, they started, evacuating their forces. And part of why the Turks were successful was they got the Germans to aid them militarily. They gave them like military equipment. They gave them like artillery, machine guns. I think the Germans even gave them like mines where they could mine the whole Dardanelles Strait to prevent ships from going up it and stuff like that. And he had this man named Otto Liman von Sanders, who was a German general. He actually went over there, and he was actually one of their main advisors that helped out the Turks and why they were so successful in the Gallipoli campaign. Oh, but they had this general you may have heard of named Mustafa Kemal, now called Kemal Ataturk. Now, he was really the greatest general on the Turkish side in the war, and he was like the hero of basically Gallipoli. He's kind of one of the one as well. And he later was called Ataturk, which, by the way, means father of Turkey. And as you know, after the war, he's instrumental in creating the Republic of Turkey, which formed in 1923. He was later, by the way, the first president of Turkey that they'll have. So he's kind of a big hero from the war. But the Turks are kind of reorganized, around basically Turkey, and they lose all their other states later because the British end up defeating them later. Now, there's one more thing I'm going to talk about today, and that's probably it. I'm going to get into, and I'm going to talk also about the Battle of Verdun. That was the other big campaign that, was fought really in the war in those years, like mostly in 1916 that you had. Verdun was considered one of the bloodiest battles in World War I. It's up there with the Battle of the Somme as well, which was also in the same year as well. In fact, those are like the two bloodiest battles of the whole war. Verdun and Somme, which I think combined, those battles must have had like 1 to 2 million killed or wounded or more. It was really, really bad. And they're kind of like stalemate battles almost, where neither side almost didn't really win. Verdun, by the way, lasted like 9 months and about 3 weeks. So almost 10 months long. Started, I think, February 21st. And went to like December, I want to say 18th, 1916. So it was a war which was the longest in World War I. It's not really the bloodiest battle of all time, though. They think the bloodiest battle of all time, of course, is the Battle of Stalingrad, which was fought between 1942 to 43 between the Germans and the Soviet Union. I think the casualties were a little higher than that one. But what was the battle like? What was Verdun? What was it about in all that? Verdun was a German offensive battle to conquer part of the northeastern part of France. And they fought over a region around what is called Verdun, which was kind of like this medieval area that went back. It was like a medieval village there originally that was there a long time ago. I think the Treaty of Verdun there was some kind of treaty signed there a long time ago. I know that in medieval times, I think it was. But it was based around the Meuse River. And what it was, they had these strategic forts that were there called Fort Douaumont, Fort Vaux, and Fort Souville. And so the Germans wanted to take control of those forts. And then they thought maybe if they could concentrate their forces enough, like in one spot, they could break through. And so it was kind of like this war of attrition, more or less. It was fought. And on the German side, they had this general named Erich Falkenhayn. And he used kind of a war of attrition. He thought that if they could kill more French than Germans, that would lead to, maybe a breakthrough on that front, and then that would lead to the end of the war. And so total casualties for Verdun vary. It's kind of, they're not sure exactly the total number, but it has to do with like the vicinity, like there and around it, roughly. But I think the numbers now vary somewhere between 1 million to like 1.2 million that were killed, wounded, captured, or whatever in that conflict. That's like 10 months almost. They're fighting. Oh, the other general they had there, who's also very famous, is Pétain. They call him Philippe Pétain, really, is what his real name is. But Pétain was, of course, the so-called Lion of Verdun. He's known by, and Pétain, that's what they call him, the Lion of Verdun. And it's his forces that mostly are commanded by him at what is Verdun. And anyway, if you know about him, he's controversial. He was a great hero, during the war. But later, if you know about when the Germans took over France in World War II, he became the head of Vichy France, as one of their leaders. And so he is kind of controversial later, but he's the one that really prevented the German breakthrough at Verdun. And he also popularized this motto that was basically, "They shall not pass," which I think was contributed to another French general, but he started using it, and a lot of his troops kind of use it as like a way to boost morale, like on the Western Front and all that. And so I think if the Germans would have broken through at that point, in 1916, that would have been the end of the war that they had. They did have this other battle called the Battle of Somme, which was fought from July to about December 1916 as well. And that one involved mostly the British. It was kind of like a counterattack battle to relieve pressure on the Battle of Verdun. And that one was pretty bloody too. Like both those combined were really the bloodiest battles really ever fought in World War I. I think the British suffered more casualties in the Somme battle than any other battle, probably in World War I combined. Because I think I told you they had I want to say 900,000 men killed in the war. I think the French, it was like 1.4 million was the total amount of men that were killed in the war overall. One thing that is famous after those battles, 1916 to 17, the Germans decided that they needed a new defense line. And so if you know what happened was they started building the so-called Hindenburg Line, which is well known in the war. That's the one that the Allies fight against between 1917 and 1918, which held up for a while, of course. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, 1917. That came out a couple of years ago, whatever. It was pretty good. It was about that. They kind of discovered that, being built or whatever. And anyway, so yeah, we'll get more into the war later. I am, of course, going to, talk more into like the Russian Revolution because, the Russians are going to drop out of the war. They're losing the war to the Central Powers. The Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II is going to eventually abdicate his throne. And so the Russian Empire is going to collapse. And so you'll see the advent of the Soviet Union coming in and all that during that period. We'll also talk about the United States, how they get in the war too. The U.S. enters the war 1917. That was considered a major turning point in World War I. I think without U.S. aid, I'm not sure if the British, French would have been able to defeat the Germans on the Western Front totally. And then we'll get to the end of the war, like 1918, and what happened, of course, with the Treaty of Versailles, of course, being created after the war. So we'll kind of get into the post-World War I era a little bit, because we'll see later the rise of fascism that comes in, after the war. So that's pretty much it for today. Like I said, if you have any, comments, questions about this lecture, let me know later. I look like anybody had any comments, questions. I know today looks like it overall, but hope you all have a great rest of the semester upcoming. Like I said, you got a lot of new assignments you got out there that you got to wrap up on. You got the book report vocab, of course, coming up. I did have that new quiz I've got coming up on the Industrial Revolution and socialism, but that's not due later until the end of the month, I believe. But don't forget, you've got that second exam that you've got still up now. You got to wrap it up, get that done, of course. I might leave it open until tomorrow if you need it. I'll probably just do that, but try to get it wrapped up by tonight. So that's it for today. Hope y'all take care and have a great rest of the week, more or less. So y'all take care.